Okay, very good morning, all of you. Yeah, please take the seats. So, this is our opportunity to welcome Professor Singh sir, Professor A.K. Singh sir, who was the main person for this workshop. So, as a vice president of Insight, is his effort. He then contacted Oil India, and then got the funding, and then it is his vision that we are here, and to discuss about this workshop on the quantitative geomorphology. Yeah, so we all know about the major contribution of Singh sir. The OSL lab or the OSL chronology has started from his labs, and currently all labs in India which are working, they are running by his students. So it is the major contribution in the quaternary geology which has came, and then we are grateful, and then it is a great opportunity to listen about the luminescence chronology from the father of chronology in India. And so I welcome sir, and then uh, we will give you the talk.
This is one, right? ये क्या है? I don't need it. Well, good morning. Can you hear me? Can you put this off? Yes. I hope you are having good time in this workshop, and I expect that in a 2 years, India will have many such groups working on quantitative geomorphology. And I thank Vikrant Jain. In fact, Vikrant Jain puts me into trouble. I known him since he was a student, and now when he is a professor, I feel very old. And so whenever he's there, I feel very old. Now what I'll do is, I'll share with you what we have learned from this technique, luminescence dating, but I like to put this technique in a perspective, so you appreciate what it's about, and you can stop me wherever you want me to stop. These are the two people who have been responsible. First is Martin Aitken, who started developing luminescence technique way back in the 50s, and when he started working on luminescence, he had one student, PhD student, and he thought with that one PhD student, he will establish everything. And then it turns out that we have about several hundred PhDs, and still we do not know many things about luminescence. So I will share with you what we can do and what we cannot do with this technique. This is a man, Dr. Nambi, who is a man of health physics, where they use the same technique to measure radiation exposure to people. You must have seen people using X-ray operators or wearing a badge. Same, and he was the one who pioneered in this in India, and he was the one to have attempted dating in India first time, and then I became into picture. Now we are looking at terrestrial deposited and processes, and these are important because they have human dimensions. We look at hazards, they have importance in the food security. It's not working. Food security, and the major issue is that these deposits are never actually uniformly deposited. Don't worry about it. I will give you the slides. I'll give you the slides, so don't worry about it. Important thing is, these deposits are very poorly preserved. Only 10% of the record typically, and I will show you those examples, that is created is preserved. So your forcing function is seen in a phase-lagged manner for only 10% of the time. Until this technique, we did not know the technology. On the land records, all the terrestrial processes have critical thresholds. You have to cross a certain threshold to be able to create a record, and again I'll come back to it. And we now talk in terms of what is the response time of landforms and processes. So when you try to model it, a landform or a process, river process, you need to understand how long, what are the thresholds, and what is the response time of a landform. Now, landform is like a physical entity, and the forcing function, which could be a earthquake, could be a flood, anything, would take time to be recorded here. And of that record, only 10% gets preserved. Forcing, I will just say, suppose I ask you to all of you to stand up. Some of you will stand up early, some of you stand late. It will be a kind of a Gaussian distribution. So there is a response time to a perturbation that is important. So what happens is land records are often truncated, very truncated. 10% of the time the land records are there, lags, and there are specific windows where you can create a record. So it's not that you can create a land record at will. And remember again that even if you create a record, what you observe today is a fraction of the created record which is preserved. We are only looking at the preserved record. And that's an important part I like to bring to your kind notice because I will come back to it in my lecture. Now, how do you create a land record? You need to have a climate or a forcing function, could be tectonics. Then you have to have mechanism to produce sediment. Then you should have sediment which is available for you to transport it. You should have a transport capacity, which could be water, wind, vectors should be there to transport it. And then together this, you have to preserve it. What happens is once you do this, you will automatically realize in doing all this cycle, creation of sediment, transport and preservation, deposition preservation, there is a phase lag between the forcing function and what you get. And this phase lag could be few hundred years to few thousand years to few tens of thousands years. So whatever we do to the land today may be impacted, or what we do to the climate today may be seen on the land maybe a few hundred years ago, from now, or few thousand years from now. And I will show you examples of that happening. Yes. Yes. No, it's because of it's arid, so there's not much of binding of moisture binding, and the winds are stronger. No, it is meant for dry land response.
Achha,
It could
dry
be a
land
fluvial
response.
response.
Okay.
I should have mentioned, I used the example of dry land, but
Right.
you can translate this to fluvial response. That's why. But normally you will find, even in your case, you can draw a similar figure and do that. The only thing I want to say that forcing function to what you get, preservation, has a long trajectory to go. And implicit in this is that often we correlate forcing function from ice cores or ocean records to land records. That is totally wrong, because we ignore all these processes. We believe that this forcing function gets translated to preserved record instantaneously. Never this happens. This we have learned from the use of luminescence, and I will try to show you examples. So what happens is, if you look at the oceanic records, everything that falls in gets preserved. Not always, but mostly. There are cases of turbidites and other things, but everything that falls in gets preserved. So these are spatially continuous, temporally continuous records. Ocean only accumulates. Reworking can occur, but minimal. On continental sequences, you can not only have accretion, which could be continuous, could be semi-continuous, but this kind of records could also have erosion going on simultaneously. So you have discontinuous records. So continuous, especially isolated records, of course, and temporal discontinuous records. So whenever you compare ocean and land, or ice core and land, you must remember one thing: you are comparing an apple with an orange. A record which is continuous, especially homogeneous, with a record which is rarely preserved and discontinuous. So one of the important things we must realize also is that even in the length record, the spatial heterogeneity is so much that you need to first work out the completeness of record. And that means you should have a proper type section. Type section means you have a complete story of biology or chemistry, complete story of the lithology and chronology. So this completeness of record, as far as possible on the land, is to be done. And rarely you will find, and I'll show you an example again, that completeness paradigm is complete. The land records are totally truncated, and any effort to correlate records, even 100 kilometers away from each other, can be dangerous until you have secured chronology. Until and unless you have secured chronology. So even if I have to compare a record from Ahmedabad to 40 kilometers away in Mehsana or whatever, you will find that there could be spatial heterogeneity of records. And that's an important part, just because of the local factors that control sediment supply and sediment preservation. So that's important. Now, if you look at dating methods, all what you need to understand about dating method is contained in this slide. Think of a beaker being filled by a drop of water. If I have a constant drop rate, if I know that the beaker was empty, if I know the number of drops in the beaker, I can calculate the time it has taken. So 120 drops is 120 years if the drop rate is 1 per year. Provided I can assure that I did not have any unknown input of a drop, or I did not have an unknown leak in the drop. I did not lose any drop due to evaporation. So I must make sure that there is no loss of water or addition of water. That means the system was a closed system, right? Now I could also have an example of a leaky beaker. The beaker is leaking, right? I started with a filled beaker, and somewhere, for some reason, it started leaking. If the leak rate is constant, I know the initial volume, I know the present value, I know the rate of decay, I can calculate time, right? The first example of filling beaker is a case of luminescence, where the signal increases with time. The second example is a radiocarbon, where signal decreases with time. I'll come to it. All techniques for dating use this principle. You should know the initial value of the parameter, a physical chemical parameter. You should know the final value of the parameter. You should know the drop rate or leak rate. And more importantly, you should know that there are no unknown leaks or inputs to the system. That is, the system was a closed system. That's an important part of it. Importantly, you must also realize that in this case, the signal to noise ratio is decreasing. So as you go with time, in 40, 50,000 years, signal to noise ratio in radiocarbon becomes so small, you cannot take a message. Whereas in luminescence, theoretically, our signal increases, the older the better it is. But there are other issues that will come. The other issues will be the volume of the beaker that I have. If I keep filling it, after this volume, I'll get a sense of saturation, right? In this case, I'm essentially limited by signal to noise ratio. In this case, the range will be limited by the volume of the beaker that's there. Beyond this volume, beyond 240 drops, the beaker will spill over. What is gained will be lost. And so this will control the limit of the dating techniques, right? In case of luminescence, we think in terms of what is the amount of saturation dose that I'll come to, but just to tell you that these are the limiting factors. One is the signal to noise ratio, other is the volume of the beaker. The amount of signal your material can hold is also limited. That's what we do. There are other methods, just for completeness that I have included. There are methods like feeding, paleomagnetism, and ice warp counting. Now tree rings, you know, many trees add one ring per year, right? So if you know a year when the tree was cut, you can count backwards the ring width and you can then date it. And if you have unknown tree, then there are master chronologies for the region. So you can compare the ring width sequence. Very complex mathematical algorithms are available, which looks at the pattern of the ring widths, and they can compare and you can extend it. And at present, the maximum extent of ring width tree ring chronology is about 14,000 years from the Bristlecone pines in USA. 14,000 years is there. And this has been used very effectively in radiocarbon. I'll come to it. Paleomagnetism is yet another properties which is applicable to sediments which are essentially deposited under a free falling conditions. Could be air, could be water. So each sediment have some magnetic rays which see the Earth's magnetic field when they fall. So you have a north-south, it just get oriented according to the Earth's magnetic field as it slowly settles down through Stokes law. And once it settles down, it gets locked. And you can look at a sequence of normal, reverse, normal polarity because Earth's magnetic field has been changing every 800,000 years to million years. It has been reversing. So you have a sequence of normal, reversal, and your unknown sequence can be tied to a known sequence of global magnetic polarity sequence through an independent age of potassium argon, age of volcanic ash, or a horizon which has a specific biota. You can use a biochronology to tie up and then extend record. Now, in all this, assumption would be that your accumulation rates are constant. If you want to extrapolate age to an age of particular horizon, you have to assume an accumulation because you have entire zone linked to another zone. So you will find that you have to assume a constant accumulation. There are various other aspects. It could be a lecture by itself. I will not go into it. Then there are techniques like amino acid decimalization, obsidian hydrogen, and fluorine to nitrogen. These again use amino acid, for example. Amino acids are left-handed on storage. They keep converting into right-handed symmetry, and L2R ratios, which are time dependent, can be used for chronology. Now, the rate of change is a function of temperature, and this temperature has changed in the past. So, what happens is you have a process where you assume a rate of constant temperature, but you cannot really implement it. There is always a kind of a model age that you get in amino acid. I will not go into the details, but I wanted to show you that these methods also are in the market. Radioactive decay methods, potassium, argon, potassium are also in the market, and I will talk about it. But the simple thing is that in the radioactivity, suppose you look at thorium or 230. Now, thorium 230 is particle reactive. It will absorb and go away in the system in a water, in a reverse system. So, either you start with the radioactivity with the excess of thorium or some depletion of uranium. And then from there onwards, with time, it will change, decay, and regain equilibrium. So, only thing what we do is, you know the starting value of thorium or the final value of thorium, and use it, and you know the decay rates. Now, these are applicable to, say, carbonates, where you know that material when it's deposited either is with thorium or without thorium, and you can find an age based on the amount of thorium activity. And then the fourth is radiation damage method, EL, OSL, ESR, and fission tracks. So this is a kind of techniques that are available to you in the dating for quaternary sediment, and there are good books which I will show you in the end. You may want to refer. So if you look at radiocarbon dating, the range is 40,000 years, 50,000 years. The measurement precision is very high. You can measure radioactivity with acute precision. But we find that the production rate of radiocarbon has been changing with time. because of variety of factors. And so, though high precision, I will come to in a minute, I need to calibrate radiocarbon ages to calendar ages. And when I calibrate those, I lose a fair bit of precision in my record. And that's a worrisome thing, but we cannot do anything about it. Fortunately now, we have a calibration curve almost up to 40,000 to 45,000. So all the radiocarbon dates in principle can be calibrated to calendar ages. Whenever you report radiocarbon age, you write BP before present, and which implies that 1950 is the baseline. All radiocarbon ages refer to 1950 as the baseline, and you have to write BP so that always radiocarbon ages will have BP with it before present, which is 1950. So if you want to measure, compare radiocarbon age with say luminescence age, which is measured in 2010, you already are 2020 now, you already have a 70 years time lag. You have to, once you compare, you have to take into account the 70 years of. So when you're looking at very young records, you should not compare directly, but 70 years should be taken into account to be able to compare. Then there are issues of actually preservation of organic matter. In Europe, it's good, the climate is good to it, but India, climate is hot and humid. So preservation of organic matter is a big issue. And this preservation often leads to contamination by rainwater, by groundwater, whatever it is. There are issues with diagenetic alterations, there are issues with reservoir age, and more importantly, you have to assume that your organic matter and the strata were formed together. It is quite likely that these pluvial systems can transport organic matter from a pre-existing organic matter to the sediment strata. So you may have an inbuilt bias towards older ages just because you cannot establish directly your organic matter is formed at the same time as the sediment. So there is an assumptions involved even all radiocarbon ages that sample and strata are correlated. This may or may not be correct. The second thing is you assume that you do not have any alterations of samples during the storage due to diagenesis, due to rainwater, and these are the issues that makes radiocarbon ages on the terrestrial sequences very dicey. They are used. If they work beautifully. If they don't work, so it's always good to look at charcoal formed in situ. But if you look at organic debris, you'll find they are problematic. The second technique which is used for quaternary mostly is actually uranium series dating. Again, a very precise technique used very well for speleothems, but range is 300,000 years. You don't need any calibration. Precision is high, but needs pure carbonate. If you do not have pure carbonate, if you have a dirty carbonate with a small amount of dust in it, you may have to make corrections for the input of detrital thorium-230, and which may be which may be complicated. So this is a good technique, but the range being only 300,000 years and the requirement of pure carbonate limits its use to very few localities, mostly speleothems or tetravertices. Even there, need to be very sure that carbonate did not go through an diagenetic alteration. Okay. Then is the cosmogenic isotopes, where you are looking at cosmogenic, and you must have heard a talk 2 days ago. You gave a talk, right? So we have an expert in cosmogenic isotopes. So you must have seen that when the rock is getting exposed to cosmic rays, you can induce or create radioactive material in them due to nuclear interactions, and you can count those atoms to be able to talk in terms of exposure ages. The major issues with this is that you need to have a very clear idea of the geometry of radiation. You don't have to write, I'll give you the slides. Don't write, just listen to it and ask me questions. Don't worry about writing. I'll give you the slides, so it's all yours. Okay? So So you need to worry about geometry of radiation. Second thing is you need to worry about how constant was geometry. Suppose there is a boulder which has been transported multiple times. So I was exposed, I have a certain way of reproducing. When I go back, I'm producing this way. So the exposure history is complicated. And that we need to ascertain to be able to apply this. Then it's also likely that the rock was sitting in the Himalayas, it was weathered, where the grains had acquired certain amount of cosmic isotopes. And with that grains, they were transported, buried as a point bar, kept there for a few hundred years, again re-excavated, goes on and on. You may end up with a very complicated exposure history, and that you need to be careful about. So, and then another thing that happens in the soft sediments is that they constantly accrete. We increase, right? Lake sediments accrete, river sediments accrete. These are accretion. So as the sediment increases, the cosmic ray exposure rate attenuates, changes. So you have a situation where you have a changing cosmic ray exposure with time, and time is what you want to find out. You end up with a model age. See, you have to assume certain rate of change of cosmic ray exposure, and time the rate I need to have. So you will end up with a model age. Am I clear? So whenever you do this cosmic error, especially on soft sediment, you have to be careful about that your accretion rate for the period has to be very well known. Otherwise, you by independent method. Then you know the time, then why should you go to cosmic ray? But there are areas where cosmogenic isotopes can do wonders. And I'm sure he has shared with you, and I will talk about it towards the end of my talk. Now, just to remind you of radiocarbon, we have cosmic ray, the atmosphere, we have, from there we get neutrons, they interact with N14 in the atmosphere, to form carbon-14. Carbon-14 then interacts through photosynthesis, and everybody of us have an amount of carbon-14. It goes to photosynthesis, we eat plants, we eat plants, and then the animals eat us, and everybody gets labeled with a radiocarbon. So if you look at the radiocarbon content of all of us right now, is same. But the day we are removed from the system, our interaction with the atmosphere stops. When we die or a tree is cut, then this radiocarbon amount that we have starts decaying. And we know that in 5,730 years, it becomes half. Then another 5,000, it becomes half. So if you know exactly the amount of radiocarbon at present, which is equivalent to the standards of 1950, which is calibrated 1950 at the time, right? And compare with what you have, you can get in time. This is very well. Provided, of course, your system, your bones did not interact with the atmosphere and did not get contaminated. There was no diegenetic alteration of any kind. So this is radiocarbon. So what happens is you have radiocarbon, N14, carbon-14, carbon dioxide, photosynthesis, animals, we eat plants, and they, once we die, this bone, then carbon-14 decays, and all you need to do is see 14 to 12 ratios you measure, and you know the time. On this scale, you know the time. Now, one of the things they found was that due to changes in magnetic field, due to changes in many other things, radiocarbon ages, as we went down, were younger. And what was done is that they measured 3-ring radiocarbon content in 3 rings. And in 3 rings, what they found, we know exactly year by year, and you can measure it. They found that the age, this curve was far more complicated, and in general, the radiocarbon was younger. And at about 20,000 years, it's about 10% of the time. So although you make a good precision, but you know you have to make a calibration, and once you do a calibration, you lose all the error, and you end up with an error compared to about 10% error. Remember, so your measurement has to be calibrated, and typically at 40,000 years, calibration could be about 15%. Your radiocarbon ages are invariably younger, just because the Earth's magnetic field has been changing, production rates have been changing, and they are not changing in a monotony. They are changing up and down. So this curve has an enormous fine structure, and a lot of mathematics has to be done to be able to convert a radiocarbon number to a calendar year. Quite a bit of mathematics has to be done. I will not go into details, but I want to bring to that you should read about the calibration issues of radiocarbon. They are important things. Another important thing are that radiocarbon is used in lakes quite a bit. And what was found very recently in 2013, it was in press when I took it, but is now printed, that even within lakes, and these are lakes, salt lakes in Himalaya in Chinese area. I'm sorry the slide is not clear, but what it tells you is that even within a lake, if you take a surface centimeter of radiocarbon from 2 or 3 position lake, the ages could be variable by 1,000 years. So even within a lake, there are local pockets where radiocarbon could be enriched or could not be enriched. And this is important because so far we always took a lake one core and we found ages and assumed that the entire lake was same. But the lakes itself are not well mixed. And there could be serious issues to use radiocarbon blindly on lakes even. In fact, India, we should be doing this kind of work, looking at lakes, large lakes, and seeing what is the temporal spatial variable of the lakes, radiocarbon in the lakes. And are we making sense of what we have done? And I'm sure we are in for surprises. This is now been examined for many lakes all over the world now, this part of it. Mishke's work will be replicated now. And I think in India we need to replicate. So even within a lake, the radiocarbon here is about 1200 years, and the radiocarbon here is 3000 years. They are barely about 100 meters or 200 meters apart. So a lake system, which was considered to be a pristine, simple system, is far more complicated than we thought. Yeah. It's within the lake itself, there are mixing issues. There are water inputs coming from various sources, vegetation input coming from various sources. They have not explained it, but there are issues of mixing within the lake. These are about 100-kilometer long lakes. So lakes are large lakes, but it has got, the catchment is not single catchment. There are many catchments, many sources of carbon. And the question is which captures which area may be the reason. But the entire lake, if you look at pH is changing, everything is changing. Now they find that the lake is very heterogeneous when you look. Earlier we thought lake was, because the water comes up, but the mixing of water may not occur very easily within a lake. If you have a heavy water coming here, let's say, or a water with more salt from one area, it will always sit down compared to a water, fresh water coming because of density contrast. They will never mix up for a long period of time. In fact, you can use this to understand the hydrological processes, which has not been done. That's the input. But I think it could be anything. Could be 2000 years. It's not 1000 years. Number I gave you, but it is ranging from 100 years to 2000, 3000. If you look at this paper, I can't show you the slide well, but if you look at this paper, I can share with you. The numbers could be anywhere 100 years to 2000 years. The only thing I wanted to point out is that even within a lake, you should look for a variability. Establish that there is no variability, then you can take a lake record securely. That's all I wanted to tell you. Cosmic ray isotope, you must have heard and must have seen far impressive slide from Saptarshi than I do. Again, we produce in the rocks, quartzite, various isotopes, aluminum-26, beryllium-10, helium, all kinds of isotopes are there. And if you know that the rock is on the surface, if you know the geometry, if you know the cosmic ray flux, you know the amount of atoms produced, and you can get an age. Simple. But you assume that the geometry is constant. You assume that you know everything about the geometry. It's a big question. And that's where you get into trouble. You know that the exposure history is not easy, especially in the soft sediments. Another thing which people have been doing is to do correlations based on wiggle matching or astronomical tuning. People, you have the astronomical tuning, you do it. Now, if you look at, if you want to correlate two sequences, if you have a precise as a precise variable, then it's no issue. I can correlate any record with any record. But often what happens is when you use a proxy, you have a precise age, but variable proxy response. So each proxy isotope value or geochem will have a certain error, right? So now my wiggle matching becomes a bit more complicated. And if I have an error with age also, then I can match this peak with this peak or this peak, I do not know. I'm vague in this. So until I have secured chronology for every single record that I deal with, I may end up with serious problems if I do wiggle matching. And I will show you examples of this, that in China, almost several thousand papers where people have used wiggle matching to assign chronology to lowest deposits are in a question because of various obvious factors people ignore. So correlation when you do with ocean ice core record, I get a wiggle here, I get a wiggle here, I can match peak, peak, trough, hot, humid, that doesn't work. So my request to all of you, those who work on it, never even attempt to talk in terms of Greenland ice core or MIS3 until you have a secured chronology and a mechanism that will help you translate to tell you what is the teleconnection of an event in Greenland, of an event in Antarctica that connects your sediment here. Who told your sediment what is happening in Greenland or whatever? That teleconnection has to be established, a mechanism of teleconnection. See, you will see all papers we talk about MIS3 record, MIS4 record, Brent records, everybody talks about it. Nobody talks about it, how these records are connected. A warming episode in Greenland, how does it get reflected? When do I produce the sediment? When do I transport the sediment? When do I deposit the sediment? And when do I preserve the sediment? So the four things that are happening takes time, right? So according to me, there cannot be any correlation with any of the ice core or Greenland. It's all wrong. And I will show you some examples as I go along. But you must, if you attempt to correlate, answer those four questions. How, what is the teleconnection? What is the mechanism that your record here gets connected in terms of sediment production, sediment transport, sediment deposition, sediment preservation? What is the connectivity? And what is the time taken in this process that still allows you to link up with this? As of now, you are assuming when you correlate that what happens in Greenland instantaneously things are happening here. That doesn't happen. Geology works very differently. So according to me, all efforts for lengthy correlation are in trouble for this reason. Now I come to Loch Ness. Is there some water somewhere? Thank you. This technique is essentially looks at radiation damage. It's not radioactive, radiation damage technique. And we use mineral spectroscopy. And two minerals we use most are quartz and feldspar, but there are many other minerals I'll talk about which we can do. So we can look at the sand and silt, quartz and feldspars. We could look at single grain of quartz. We could look at gypsum. We can date gypsum, which is a chemical precipitate. And since it is a material is solid state, it will start acquiring radiation damage only when it is formed. You get the age of formation of gypsum. Volcanic ash, again volcanic ash when it's formed and is deposited. Carbonates, snails, all this can be now dated using this technique. But most of the work which has been done is based on quartz and feldspar. Important thing to realize is that we date the sediment grains themselves. So unlike radiocarbon, there is no ambiguity in correlating the sediment which you are sample which you are dating and the sediment you are talking about, because you are essentially dating the sediment itself. So there is no ambiguity of correlation. We don't need any standards. And when I started this technique, I was always told, have I compared with radiocarbon? Have I compared with this? How do we know ranges? And I always had to tell you that I don't need any standards. And all those standards which were recommended to me were wrong themselves. I ended up showing that all the standards which were recommended were not correct. We don't need any standard because we have our physics calibration that goes into it. I'll tell you how we do it. Typically, PC calibrate earlier was 10%. We have come to 5%. And if you are willing to invest more time and money of your machine, we can bring it down to 4% or 3%. But it's a huge investment in time. 5% is a reasonable error of the error on the age. Whether it is very young or whether very old, 5% will be the limit of the age. Always of that. We cannot do better than this. So if it is 10 years, the error will be 2 years. No, 0.2 years. If it is 10,000 years, it will be 5%, so 200 years. This is the typical errors we will live with. We cannot do better than this. And this is because there are many factors in measurement we have to adapt and come to it. Now, interesting thing is, if you look at the sedimentary strata, we can date the sediment, we can date the carbonate, we can date the gypsum that formed inside, we can date the volcanic ash. So, within a strata, we can get multiple ages, right? And that way, I can ensure that I have a self-consistent chronology. I can date multiple events in the history of sample, event of soil formation, event of sedimentation, event of burial, all kinds of things we can date. You can tease out more information from a sedimentary profile than by any other technique. Just because I can apply my method to a large subspecies sediment. All the chemistry that every single chemical sediment that is produced in a soil can be dated by this technique. So multiple ages using multiple signals, also another possibility. So multiple ages using multiple samples, multiple minerals, and also we have many signals. I will come to it in a minute. So we can always ensure that we are self-consistent in our approach. Sorry. The age range that we work with is from 5 years. I can measure as young as 5 years to 500,000, and we're hoping that we'll go to 1 million years in few years' time. Now, 5 years are important because 5 years to say 100 years, we also have instrumental record. So we can use this technique to calibrate our proxies to instrumental record and then extend it backward. To validate the technique, calibrate it with the instrumental record of the last 200 years or 100 years, and then, so we can use this technique to validate proxies and then use our proxies in a more reliable manner. Okay? And the other important thing now is happening is we can now date soil formation processes. We can really tackle soil form processes, and I will tell you a few new applications which have come in last few years to talk about it. But importantly, it is not a routine method. It requires considerable physics input at every level. And you cannot blindly apply technique to any sample you like, very rarely. Even the change of grain size, and if you don't take the effects due to a change of grain size which you use for measurement, you can make errors. And I'll try to show you what happens. So, now 4 kinds of events we can date. One is mineral formation event. So, we are looking at radiation damage method. So, one is you start having radiation damage only when the mineral is formed. So, all kinds of chemical precipitates come in this way. Coral, teeth, everything will come in this part. We can also do heating events. When heating occurs to 400 degree plus, all the previous memory of radiation damage is erased, is annealed. All the previous, you will understand better in a minute. got all is removed, and then you start afresh. So 400 degrees temperature removes all the previous record of radiation damage, start afresh. So this is another one. Similarly, if a material is transported by subaerially or subaqueous matter, it sees sunlight, and this sunlight also gives you lots of energy, and that also then allows you to remove all the record of the previous radiation damage, and you start building on burial and get an age. And of course, you can also date earthquakes, and I'll show you some new examples that we have done in Yaran, that we can date earthquakes, we can date seismites, we can date sand dikes with a reasonable accuracy and reliability. Quite a bit of it, and Dr. Aran Singh has worked with me on this, and we have done quite a bit of work on this. I'll share that with you. Again, what happens is when these events occur, either due to sun exposure or due to injection of heating of injector during the injection of sand dikes, that you can generate lots of heating, and that resets the signal. So you need to have either the mineral formation or a heating event to 400 degrees or a exposure to light of a few minutes to be able to remove all the previously acquired radiation damage, and then you start with the signal. Now when I say this, it also implies that your sample should not see any accidental light exposure while analysis from the field to the lab, should not see any accidental sun exposure. Otherwise, you may lose all your signal in a second. And I can give you a good story about it, that one of my students failed to find any signal in any of his samples. And we were worried because the same sample we had ages of 20,000 years. And then I found that he had a new girlfriend, and while making samples, he was constantly on his cell phone. So that cell phone exposure, light, bleached all his sediments. And it took us a month to find out what was wrong. So even such small exposure of cell phone light. So now, of course, we have stopped, nobody goes to the cell phone in the lab. And if you have girlfriend, then you don't meet them or talk to them, you're in the lab. Or boyfriend, vice versa. So you have to be very careful that even a second of daylight exposure, you may lose 50% of your signal. And that's important. You can date almost all kinds of processes, and I'll try to give examples of this: glacial deposits, cave deposits, slope deposits, alluvial fen, tectonics, sand dunes, archaeological sites, raised beaches, everything which has sediment, everything which has quartz, feldspar, carbonate, gypsum can be dated. We are only limited by the things we can imagine, but nothing else. And now new things are happening. We can talk in terms of soil creep, we can talk in terms of exhumation, we can talk in terms of paleothermometry, which is a very recent manuscript we submitted. So these things can be done. And once you can do all this, imagine a sequence which has a mixture of fluvial, aeolian, lacustrine phases. You can date all of them, build up a self-consistent picture just because you have quartz and feldspar in there. So what has happened is that we now are able to essentially provide process rates where we did not have any process rates. There were not many ways to date sediments on the land. Radiocarbon had its problem, and this method now allows us to talk in terms of dune migration rates, soil formation rates, marine sea level changes, many things can be done. And I will show you some examples of this. About 70% of the chronology of the quaternary now is based on luminescence technique. Though there are questions, still 70% of the work, which was not the case 10 years ago, comes from luminescence. And there are about 3 to 4 papers per day. So if you are entering this field, be prepared to read about 1,500 papers a year. Monica, be careful. So we are essentially producing 1,500 papers a year now with this application of this technique globally. And I have a slide on this. We can talk in terms of response times, and I will show this geometric threshold and windows of opportunity of building sedimentary record. So very new paradigms of looking at land records on the land, looking at the land records are now coming up. Interestingly, we also found new physics while applying this technique. When this technique was first applied, way back in the 50s and 60s, it went into disrepute because the ages were too small. And one of the things was happening in a group in Philadelphia, what they did was that they assumed that all the interaction which we have radiation interaction works the same way, alpha, betas, and gammas, same way. So they computed the energy, then computed the dose rate, the environment dose rate, and say this is production rate. What they forgot is that alpha particles, beta rays, and gamma rays interact with the matter in a very, very different manner. Alpha particles, and I'll show you, I have a slide there. Alpha particle being heavy, more charged, like me, cannot run much in the same. So they put all the energy in a very small track length. Whereas beta particles and gamma rays are light, single charge, they can travel into the matrix for a long distance. Now, alpha particle therefore puts all the energy in ionizing the crystal over a very short time, to the extent that 90% of the ionization that they create is wasted by heating the crystal, is not trapped to give luminescence. Whereas the remaining betas and gammas, though are weakly ionizing, they keep on producing signals. So the contribution of alpha particles is 50%, but it gives only 10% signal. If you take into account all those ages which were wrong in the past, and so we learned about that the response of alpha particle interacting with gamma ray, interacting with material compared to beta and gamma was not the same. And this is the physics we learned when we wanted to apply this method for dating. We can now look at the radiation dose in soil at single grain level, and you will find that looks homogeneous, but at a single grain level, there's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity that occurs, and I'll explain you how it works out. One of my colleagues, Mortika, has done quite a bit of modeling on this. Then something else happens. I talked about the leak in the beaker, leaky beaker, and we found that in feldspar is a leaky beaker. If you take a feldspar, expose to radiation, keep it for a week, you lose half the signal or more than that. Now, ideally, feldspar is a very good system, it should not leak. And then it took us time to understand why it leaks. And I'll explain you in a while why it leaks. But it's again a new phenomenon that charges which should go through a certain pathways would recombine and get lost without even your realizing. It could be 60-70% of the signal goes away. That was another thing we learned. And third thing we learned about is dose rate effect. Now, when we do measurements in the environmental radiation exposure is say some units per 1,000 years. Now, the same exposure we give in the lab, which is same amount of dose in a minutes. The scaling factor from a minutes to thousands of years is about 10 to the power 7 to 10 to the power 9. So the question we have wanted to understand, how does a mineral react when is exposed to radiation 10 to the power 7 to 10 to the power 8 times faster rate than to normal. So if I gave you 1 electron, how do you respond? And if at the same time, if I give you 1,000,000 electrons, how will you respond? Is the question we answer. And this could be done by application to geology. Again, I'll explain to you when I come back. And the applications, the other application was that whatever we learned about dating, we could look at nuclear accident dosimetry. There was a big case of legal suits in America where people claimed that because of overground nuclear explosion, we got radiation exposure, right? And so the government has to compensate us for billions of dollars to do that. And there was no way to be able to assess the amount of radiation exposure. Now, one guy called Edward Haskell, and he was bright enough. He said, I will look at the building bricks which were built buildings which were built around 1950. And I can get the quartz out of the building brick and estimate based on radioactivity what is the signal it should get. Anything excess is because of nuclear fallout, right? And he did that and he showed that it was not sufficient to have caused any damage. So we could use the same technology that we developed on known age, and I'll again show you a slide on this, just to give you a preempt view. Then we also looked at health physics. All the cancer treatment that we have today, especially the proton dose we get for cancer patient, the amount of dose given to a patient is based on the same kind of technique, whereas we look at synthetic minerals like potassium bromide or sodium chloride, and we can look at the radiation damage they receive and look at OSL or TL of them instantly and can calibrate the dose to a microgray level. So this is whatever we learned in geology are applicable to health physics also equally well. This I told you that you see about 1,500 papers per year are being produced in luminescence per year. So anybody entering this game should be prepared to read 1,500 papers a year, 3 papers a day, 4 papers a day. Okay. I'll skip this. Now, what is luminescence? Luminescence is a process by which an excited mineral emits light in a process over and above the black body radiation. If you heat a sample, it becomes red hot, then it becomes yellow and white, it becomes hot. So it's a black body radiation. It's a background. Now, anything over and above emitted by the mineral is called luminescence. And this occurs because the material has some properties which allows it to generate more light than black body radiation. So what happens is, when you take a material and expose it to some kind of ionizing radiation, could be alpha particles, could be beta rays, could be gamma rays, could be X rays, could be cosmic rays, then this mineral you create metastable states. Don't worry about the detail, but some states are created which store the signal. And these metastable states have a stability in the range of years to millions of years, and they stay. The stable states stay put until you stimulate in the laboratory, and when they de-excite, you get light, and which light is proportional to radiation. This is what happens. You are creating matter, and I'll show you in a minute what are metastable states. And interestingly, crystals are like human beings. More the defect, more bright they are. All the bright people are eccentric. Your teachers must be more eccentric than some other teachers. All the bright, similarly, the crystals are more bright when they have more defects. The feldspar is more brighter than quartz because it has got more defects, but it has its own complications. And the fun is to understand those complications. Now, what happens is, you recall the crystal structure of NaCl, 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 Na plus Cl. If I remove a Cl atom from there, then I have a vacancy where I can put an electron because there are all 4 Nas to hold it back, right? You have blackboard here. I can always keep an electron here, and this electron will see these positive charges and remain here for as long as you like. This is F center in or color center. So such defects are produced. So when you expose a sample to radiation, you essentially ionize the atoms. You take out electrons from the atoms. Now these electrons walk in the crystal. They keep on walking in the crystal, and some of those less than 1% of this will find these kind of sites and they will sit there, right? So if you have more exposure, more electrons are produced, electrons and holes produced, and more are the such trapped charges will happen, right? So this is one example of such traps. I can put an electron between these charges, I can put electron here, I can put electron here, I can put electron here, or a positive. Similarly, I can put 2 electrons here, various kinds of impurity compensation. Essentially, you want to create a charge compensation. You want to keep the crystal neutral. So wherever I need a negative charge, I'll put a negative charge. Where I need a positive, I'll put a positive charge. So that crystal energy goes down. What happens is, now what happens here, you must have read about atomic structure, right? You have a hydrogen atom, you have atomic states. Now if you put 2 hydrogen atoms, they get mixed up, you get helium atom. If you put many of them, then the energy levels, which are the outer shells, are shared, because now everybody sees everybody's view. And what you end up is with what we call as a band. This is a conduction band. So this is energy level where the electrons are shared by everybody, what we call as band ferrocell. And there are certain states where the energies are bound. The electrons cannot move out of where they are. And our metastable states, which are vacancies, have to be in between somewhere. So these are shown as the short lines. Short line means they are localized. They are very localized. So I don't. So this could be a localized impurity here, localized. Now what happens is, when I give an exposure to say 1 MeV gamma ray, about this gap is 10 electron volt. This is not what. This gap is about 10 electron volt. So I will have 100,000 electron hole pairs. These will walk in the crystal, and a very few of them will be trapped in various kinds of defects. Very close to the conduction band, so it's very easy to excite. Deeper is further harder to excite, and you can get a range of this trapping can happen. Now, depending on how far they are from the conduction band, how far they are. Say here is all free. Here is, they can move freely. So one near to it will be more or less free, near to free. They can stay in these traps from a year, from a few seconds to a few million years. So these fellows can stay for a million years. This fellow may stay for a few seconds, right? So these fellows stay there. Now you'll realize that with time, this fellows, the shorter lifetime will be lost, but others will stay back. Now these electrons which I stay back, I can give them energy now. If I give them energy, either by heating or by light, in fact light is more stronger than heating, then I will excite them. So these electrons will come out, and then become free, and then they can recombine with a site which requires an electron to stabilize again. When this recombine, it will be at the outermost shell of the atom, and it will recombine and emit light. So what's happening is, I am first assuming that all the traps are, everything is empty. I ionize it, I create free electrons and hole pairs. Some of them travel, get trapped, some of them stay put. When I excite them, they go back and they get, they mix up or they meet in a hole to emit light. So the stability of the signal is where the electron resides. The light emitted by on recombination is the property of the recombination site, right? So these are two important things we need to worry about it. That you are looking at a complex phenomenon now, and that is that your light is produced. So we do quite a bit of work in understanding the stability and in understanding the kind of light emitted. Now there could be many such centers emitting in various kinds of lights, right, from infrared to blue to violet. And quite a bit of our work is to find out which are the most suitable emission lines, we can use for a particular material. That we do, and which is why we need physics people to do this. The two things are important, that I need energy, which is thermal energy. Now you can also think of a situation that I can have a series of this kind of, एक अच्छा नहीं है कोई, अच्छा नहीं है, it shows up, एक ही यही है. ये पंखा चला दूंगा. Somebody was feeling very cold. आपको ठंड लग रही थी? अच्छा अच्छा. So imagine that you can have a whole range of such traps. You could have electrons which are stable for a second, electrons are stable for years, electrons stable over thousands of years, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. You have an entire spectrum of electrons. So you could look at time scales on Earth's landscape development over various situations depending on your need. I can look at 100-year time scales, I can look at 1,000-year time scales, I can look at 10,000-year time scales, I can look at million-year time scales. So this variability of trapping and the range of energy that we have, range of stability we have, allows us to look at processes occurring on various time scales. You have to be careful of which sample you are looking at it, and each one of time scales we'll have to worry about what kind of light we have to look at. And once we understand those, we can apply this to look at a large range, and this is the only technique that allows you to look at large number of time scales. As a function of crystal structure and the impurity especially, and the charge environment of it. Like, look at sodium electron, right? This NaCl. I have a strong binding. It can stay as long as you like. But the same electron, if it's sitting very near to an interstitial site, it's easy to emit. So exactly is a function of the charge environment around it, and that's what controls it. And charge environment can be variable. I made a very simplified, but in nature is very complex, and so you get a range of energies. A range of energies, range of lifetime, means range of time scales you can deal with. In the same sample, you have many signals, and in a second I'll show you, which will have variable time scale. So same quartz will have signals which have like 110-degree peak of quartz is stable for 3.5 hours. 375 peak is stable for 1 million years or 10 million years. 325 is about 1 million years. So you have a range, and very typically, just give me a second, I'll come back to it. So what you can do is you can selectively empty out the traps of your need and work with the time scale you want to work with. This is the more complex phenomenon, structure of this, that you have, these are the trapping sites, this is the recombination site, and you can excite many kind of signals from this. I can do state excite to conduction band, go and recombine. I can excite and to here and study this part of it and again get a signal. So I can do lots of signals are available. And it's for me to understand and which signal and there. So now what happens is, I have to empty out the electrons. First is I can give energy. I have to give energy to empty out. So I can heat the crystal. I give from 0 to 400 degrees, I heat the crystal, and I get a curve like this. And I have drawn this colors to show that the emission could be in any color. Okay. So what happens is that as you heat, I can get empty out first trapping site, second trapping site, multiple trapping sites. Now the stability of the first trapping site could be as low as few hours. And every 40 degrees, you increase the stability by about an order of magnitude. So by the time you reach to 400, you are at the stability of about 10 to the power 6 years, 10 to the power 7 years, depending on the material. So you are sparing a large, so if you look at the signal here, you can look at very old sequences. If you look at the signal in between, you can look at time scale to order of few thousand years. The question of what signals you are looking for, you have a whole range of signal, and it's the only technique that allows you to look at the entire range of signals. Now I can excite the material with green light also. Now green light or blue light, what we use, have much more energy. This is increasing energy. Here I give a large amount of high energy, say photo, the laser or whatever. And what happens is that allows all the electrons to come out. Everybody comes out. Everybody goes out. There is a fire here, everybody runs away. Not that I push you out, not this, everybody runs away. So what you get here in this curve, sequentially increasing energy, I get all the signal in one go. Everybody is empty out, as the time goes, the signal goes down. This has all the information of various stabilities also. And we can deconvolute it mathematically to tease out various signals of various stabilities and work with this. Similarly, in feldspar, I can use a smaller energy light, infrared, and I can again at about 900 degrees, 880 nanometers, that I can get a signal only from feldspar. Again, this has all the information of stability that you need. Here we do with temperature, so I can increase the temperature slowly. So I can scan the stability region. Here I cannot do that, but I can tease my stability information out of this. And again, all of them can emit in any wavelength band. So fair amount of work which we do has to understand which of the emissions at what temperature excitation is useful for us. Now fortunately for you, all the work has been done. Quite a bit of work has been done to understand the optimum signals we need to use. But I just want to tell you that these are the three primary. Then there are variants of this, which are violet stimulated luminescence, post-IR, IRSL, thermal stimulated conductivity, electron stimulated resonance. They are all variants of this. And if I have time, I'll come to this. But I don't want you to be bored with this. Yes.
Why do you have two curves? What are this natural and natural plus beta?
Yes. What happens is, good you asked me. If I take a sample, this is sitting in the environment, when I expose it, all the signals are produced from 1 year stable region to a million years being produced. But as the time goes, the 1 year fellow will decay, right? So as the time goes, the older fellow will keep on growing, and 1 year fellow bigger keeps on getting empty. So when I make a plot, when I record it, I'll find that here I don't get much signal, very low, and then signal builds up. Whereas in the lab, when I do exposure, I have not allowed this 1 year fellow to decay. I measured instantly, so I see 1 year fellow, right?
I understand that, but I have one more question. The time it takes to populate, the rate at which you're populating the defects,
Yes.
is that constant across all the states?
The exposure rate is constant because environmental radioactivity, I will come to that in a moment, but environmental radioactivity is constant, right? All the radiation comes from uranium,
No, but with
potassium.
the probability with which you populate certain state,
Yes,
that
it's
is also
constant, it's
constant.
constant.
Okay.
And why it is constant is simple to understand. The material has formed billions of years ago. It has been constantly radiated. What we are looking at a very small time range of the material. So there's not much time for any of those effects. If you do metamorphism, yes, things will change. But then it will be stable there. You don't really change much in the time scale. We are looking at very small time scale of million year time scale. So we don't really worry about those things. So I remind you again, so you have a material, when you expose to radiation, you essentially create electron hole pairs, they walk in the crystal, and then they find an impurity site to stay. As the time goes, the amount of radiation exposure increases, so the number of electrons and hole pairs increases, right? As more the time, more is the trapped charges. Then what you do is, you come to the lab, and then you you excite and you get light. When you get light, you get a curve like this. Older the sample, more is the light, till you reach a saturation that is almost where the beaker is filled up, or beaker is cannot fill up more because the filling rate and the decay rate are competing. I reach equilibrium stage, right? So you are filling at a rate, it's also decaying. So every single signal will have a decay. Could be 1 year, could be a million years, could be 1,000 years, could be 100 years. So you will reach an equilibrium, and that's the equilibrium stage. For quartz, it is about 250 grays, which translate to about 100,000 to 150,000 years of time scale. For feldspar is about 600 to 800 grays, it can translate to about 500,000 years. When we started this technique, our errors were large, 10%, 15%. Now we have reached stage that we can essentially look at Heinrichs event with reasonable confidence, equivalent of Heinrichs event. So we can look at very short time scales very comfortably. I mentioned before I go to radiation dose, what happens is I talked about these electrons and holes, right? Ideally, the only allowed pathway for an electron to recombine is via the conduction band, right? You can go to the next room only via the corridor. But there are some electrons and some holes are willing to jump through the windows and recombine. They don't go through the proper route. They quantum mechanically tunnel. And physically what happens is the impurities, the electron and the hole impurities are physically nearby. So I don't go through this, but I leak out and recombine. Consequently, I lose a signal where I should not have lost a signal. And this initially we called as anomalous fading. Now we know it is a quantum mechanical phenomenon. It can happen in any system. And we can now make a correction for this. And it happens in feldspar quite often. Interestingly, what happens is the rate of decay through such process goes down very rapidly because number of electron hole pairs which can make will also decay very rapidly. And so the signal can stabilize very soon, but we need to make a correction for this. So the rate of loss could be significant, but it goes increasing. It's a log plot, so it goes increasingly slower. And we make this kind of measurements in the laboratory. I will not go into the details, but we can make a measurement to estimate what will be the loss of signal over a storage of 10, 20, 30,000 years based on a measurement in the laboratory over a period of few days. Now it's a tall order that I make a measurement of 2 days and extrapolate to 20,000 years, but there is a reasonable physics which has gone behind it, and we feel confident to do that. Shall we take a break? 1.5 hours? I have only done 1/3 of what I thought.